Here at the Cortona first meeting on science and spirituality, we are glad to interview the Professor Arthur Zajonc, who is a quantum physicist and a teacher at the Amherst College. Professor Zajonc, as a quantum physicist, what's the aspect of this discipline that changed the most your worldview?
I'd say there were two aspects of quantum physics which have been most important for me. The first concerns our view of reality. Our view of reality has been for centuries a classical worldview in which there are discrete, individuated objects which we know by their properties or attributes, their size, their mass, their color, and so on. And then when they come into relationships in that classical view, this is a secondary factor, right? So the two planets exist independently and then come into relation through gravitation, for example. This is a very powerful picture, but it is a picture of the world in terms of parts and fragments. And people have for a long time, in fact for centuries, wondered, isn't it also true that there's a way in which the universe is connected and interrelated at a more fundamental level? So philosophers and mystics and others have speculated on this for centuries, or even experienced it in some way, but it was always ineffable, not able to be understood. It feels to me that physics is beginning to provide a detailed language of holism, of interconnectedness, which takes us into a kind of clarity with regards to holism that we've never had before. For a long time as a young man, I also had the feeling there must be a connectedness at a deep level to things, but it was only a feeling, a kind of sentiment. And now through the modern quantum optics that we have, through the particular experiments that we've done, we not only can prove that there is a deep connectedness, which changes radically our conception of matter and its relationships, but also that we can know this with the same clarity and mathematical precision that we understand many other aspects of the universe. So this feels to me to give us at least the concepts that we need to have a clear understanding. It doesn't, however, really address the most fundamental concern, which is the clarity of concept is important, but it has to also be filled out with, you could say, human experience. You may understand what I'm saying, and even agree logically with what I'm saying, but it's a whole other thing to come into the experience of that interconnectedness. So how is it that, you might say, quantum mechanics helps us, invites us into this experience? So that's the second key, as it were, impact on me of the quantum mechanics, which is the question of the role of the observer. How is it we participate or are involved in nature? How is it that nature opens up to us? And here, in classical physics, again, the observer is in some ways separated and outside the system. The universe and all its different parts has its own life independent of us, and the observer, whether the observer is there or not, is of little consequence. In quantum mechanics, this is impossible, even in the formalism. You can have, yes, a Schrödinger equation and a wave function and all of this abstract mathematics, but in order for there to be any predictions, in order for there to be any kind of consequences, you have to postulate or imagine the observer who comes with a certain set of apparatus and equipment, which is a kind of question that the observer wishes to pose to nature. And the question has to be constructed in equipment. You have a question in your mind, but nature needs to have a means of expression, and so you need to bring this equipment as a kind of vehicle for the response. If you bring one kind of equipment, then one kind of question is given, and one kind of answer. If you bring another, then another. And what we find is that this set of responses, of questions and responses, again, has a kind of non-classical structure to it. See if I can make this clear. There are two or three difficulties. One is that the responses which nature gives to the quantum questions we ask do not give a simple picture of the natural world. They often have contradictory elements. So it's impossible to imagine moving, as it were, around the object and having a simple picture of what this object is. If I take a hand and I look at it from different sides, I can see that it has shape and size and color and all its attributes, and then we can form a consistent three-dimensional picture of this. If, on the other hand, this is a quantum object, then when I look at one attribute, the complementary attribute doesn't exist. Then I look at the complementary attribute, and the first attribute doesn't exist. In fact, they are logically contrary. They're logically contradictory to one another. Which means that the only way in which we can really come to understand this world is by our involvement. It doesn't have an independent existence. Right? So as opposed to having an independent model, it brings the observer in. This is underscored by special relativity and general relativity, where the same thing happens. The primary attributes by which we come to know nature in the classical tradition, length, mass, particle number, and so forth, these are invariant in the classical physics. They're stable. In the case of quantum physics and relativity, these become, you could say, dependent on the observer. So this leads me to a picture of all of that which we experience, all of that which we even measure in the laboratory, is given through relationships. As opposed to an objective world that's given without relationship, that's unto itself. We have a world which is given via relationships, the lengths, the time intervals, the simultaneity, the different measurements we make in quantum experiments. All of these presuppose the experimenter, the apparatus, the observer, and everything is given through that. And if we try to construct a world which is, as it were, outside of us and independent, we fail again and again and again. We keep being thrown back to ourselves. What this shows to me is, if we take this seriously, this lesson of modern physics, then as opposed to thinking of experience as the problem, subjectivity has always been the problem in modern physics, or classical physics even. It's actually the fulcrum. So as opposed to trying to get rid of experience as an embarrassment and replace this with machines and abstractions, you realize this is hopeless, that the physics itself says this is impossible, and that the solution is rather to welcome the experience, to welcome the observer back into the science, and to put it at the center. And then we have this little expression, right, that maybe it's experience all the way down, right, that experience becomes the foundation at every level. So I'd say a new picture of the universe which is holistically structured with clarity and precision, and then that holism includes also the human being, the human observer, in a fundamental and irreducible way.
We know that classical sciences base their view on the third-person perspective. Could you define what third-person perspective means? With an example you made today, I find very, very clear.
Yeah. Well, if we begin with this first-person experience, which is a lived and embodied experience, then we may take certain of these attributes, which are lived experiences, and we reduce them from the lived experience to something which we believe produces them, that is more fundamental. So, for example, if one has a color experience, let's say a particular object, again, take my hand since that's easy to look at. That hand has a certain color. It has a ring on it. Now what happens is I begin to look at that color and I say, well, that's not a primary feature of the hand. The wavelength is more primary because it is a distance. Already from what I've said before, this is a problem because distances can change under different circumstances of relativistic transformations. But nonetheless, we say there's a certain color. That color is really produced by an electromagnetic wave of a particular wavelength. So what I've done, as it were quietly, is to replace the lived experience with a model that has produced this lived experience. And I do that for every feature of the hand. So now I create an image in my mind, a model of the hand, take the hand away as lived experience. There's the model of the hand. Well then, I made it, it's quite beautiful. In some ways I fall in love with this model. And I put it into the world, and I reify it, I call it real. And then everything becomes explained and understood in terms of this system of models which are abstracted from out of the lived experience. And then they become reality. You know, the actual hand that I have, open and closed, is just an illusion, right? It's a sense illusion. It's an epiphenomenon. The reality are the atoms, molecules, quarks, quarks and gluons, and the fundamental particles, and so on. It's a strange thing that we begin to take as more real than our lived experience and the lives that we have upon this planet, than the abstractions we create. These third-person point of view, therefore, which is the only thing we have in common. Yeah. If you look at my hand, you see one side, I see the other side. Well, then I flip it around. Now I see one side, you see the other side. There is no third-person object that we actually ever experience. We only experience the first-person point of view. But we can construct the third-person object, put it into the world, call it real, give our devotions to it, make all of our science, technology, and even our society pay homage to it. It becomes a kind of idolatry. You know, an idol is a statue which is meant to represent the divine, some aspect of the divine. But when the idol becomes worshipped in the place of the divinity to which it's pointing, then it's idolatry. And these third-person models are very useful. They're very powerful and productive. But when you forget that they're creations like a statue, well, then you fall in love with them, you begin to worship them, and you forget the reality that they're mainly meant to point to. Yeah. Goethe called it das Wesen, how difficult it is to keep the being ever before one, and not to replace it with the word, with the symbol, with the abstraction. Yeah. We do this all too often. So the third-person point of view, nothing wrong with it as long as one is awake to what one's doing, but one in some sense falls asleep. Another line from Goethe where he says, there's nothing wrong with models and hypotheses except that they can be used by the teacher to put the pupil to sleep, right? It's easier to talk about models and hypotheses, and far more difficult to enter into the direct experience of reality that's with us, including the relationships and lawfulness and, you could say, mysteries that are part of this natural world directly.
It seems to me that that argument is a good argument against the zombies world, you know, the hypothesis of a world similar to our world, where just machines or zombies, that means creatures without life, as this morning somebody mentioned. But what you said, it seems to me to be an argument, a definitive argument against the world, the zombies world.
Yeah. You know, this question of the zombies world, I'm no expert on zombies. But, I mean, the point in some ways is to imagine a world where all of the behaviors in the zombie world, all of the actions and behaviors of zombies are similar to our own. But they fail to have an interiority, right? That they fail to have a first-person point of view. So you have a world of pure mechanism, yeah? But now, you know, part of the problem there is, how is it we describe this world of zombies? we imbue meaning and purpose even, perhaps, to this zombie world. It's an experience that we have. We see certain actions that look similar to human actions. But we can only judge, as it were, from the outside. So we project, in a certain sense, our understandings and expectations onto that world, and it becomes, therefore, complex, difficult for us. If, however, the zombies are acting only on the basis of, I don't know, neural programming or something of that sort, they have no interior experiential space of the kind that we have, then it's no different than a ball rolling down a hill, right? It's simply a set of mechanistic outcomes to a series of complex programs. If that's the case, then in what sense is there an inner world, to that world of zombies? In what sense can the zombies make any meaning out of their actions? In what sense is there a direction or purpose? Isn't it simply just the mechanisms unfolding over time? So it might be that this could be an argument which would have something to do with the zombies, but I leave that up to you.
You promote the contemplative experience as an important element in the scientist's training and practice. Could you please give us some details about your idea?
Yeah. So I think that there are two sides to being a scientist, at least. One side is to master the formalism, the thinking, the style of thinking, the logic, the rational inquiry, both in the laboratory and in the theoretical form that we have it. And this we do, I think, with real clarity, excellence in many universities around the world. But as any physicist knows, you do not become a physicist in order to be, you could say, a kind of technician, a person who can compute efficiently, who can run experiments efficiently. You become a scientist of any sort. Become a scientist because of the joy of discovery. This is what you live for. You may have only one significant discovery in your life, or even a small discovery, or maybe a half a dozen. And then there are some, like Einstein and the great physicists of the 20th century, and even today, where the creativity is extraordinary, at least during certain periods of their lives. You can just see they have mastered sufficiently the existing knowledge, and they know how to think through that knowledge. But then they move into another mode of engagement with that material that is quite different than the normal analytical approach. That you could say they live their way so fully into the material, and they hold its complexities, and even its certain impossibilities, paradoxes, problems that have been insoluble, perhaps for decades. And they hold them in their mind without drifting or losing the thread, not just for minutes, but sometimes for days and weeks and months and even years, where it's just they're living inside that question, inside the not knowing, inside the complexity. And they do this very often with a certain rhythm of attention. There's a kind of concentration on the work at hand. David Bohm describes this also. Concentration on the work at hand, the details, the hard, tough details of the problem. And then there's the walk on the beach, where you're just kind of wide open. It's still with you and it's kind of echoing through you, but it's wide open. And then you go back the next day and you come back to the problem again and you're focused intensively on the issue at hand. And then you're off with your wife walking across the street or the bridge, like William Rowan Hamilton is a favorite story of mine, where he'd been working on what we now call quaternions, a kind of hyper-complex number system, which would have its own laws of arithmetic, of multiplication and addition and so on. And he knew it must exist. He just had an intuition that this must be possible. But he couldn't figure out the arithmetic of this number system, and so in some ways he didn't discover a proper number system. His children were supposed to have said to him each morning, "Daddy, have you learned how to multiply triplets?" which was the arithmetic operation. And he'd say, "No, I can add them, but I can't multiply them." And he studied this again and again, and then he reports he was walking across a bridge in Belfast one day. He was an Irish mathematician. He was with his wife going off to a meeting, a concert or something. So he was living it was all in him, but he was not listening to his wife talk, unfortunately, but, expanded and opened. And then in that moment, he saw the multiplication of triplets. And he took out his knife and he carved the identity into the railing of the bridge. It's still there today. But I don't know if you can feel with me that if one knows meditation, which you and I have both practiced for many, many years, there is this rhythm of focused, single-pointed attention, samadhi, concentration, on an object. In this case, the object in his case, was a mathematical problem. In the case of a physicist, it might be a physical issue or problem. And then, it's not enough to simply concentrate on it. One has to, as it were, release the object, become open and receptive to what is new and surprising. And if you're only focused on the single object, you are not available for surprise, for discovery. But if you don't study the object, then you have no direction for, you could say, your open awareness. There's no orientation, no path that you're on. And so there's no, you could say, possibility for a directed insight. So I speak of a kind of breathing, not in the physical breath, but a breathing which is a breathing of our attention. Attention between focused, concentrated attention, and then open awareness. Focused, concentrated attention, and then open awareness. And so when I work with faculty members and science students and others on meditation in their studies at the university, which I do quite widely in the United States, I emphasize that not only is meditation beneficial for our quality of life, our emotional stability, our inner well-being, all of which are very important for students and faculty alike, but it actually can contribute as a mode of enhancing, or means of enhancing our discovery process, our creativity, our insight into the world around us. I call it contemplative inquiry. That meditation can become a form of contemplative engagement that leads to a personal growth and transformation of capacities in us that are suited to insights. And once we have those insights, we have contemplative knowing as a fruit of contemplative inquiry. So this whole process of engagement leads to a transformation of the human being that can help achieve insight in physics, but in any field of engagement, any field of study.
Is there a danger in introducing this new way of becoming creative? Because maybe there is not a criterion for distinguishing between good and evil.
Between good and evil, yes.
And evil, yeah. So maybe you can become creative, but for weapons.
For weapons,
yeah.
Yes.
How to relate the creativity with the ethics?
Yeah. I think this is a very important question. So, in my own view, the way one undertakes meditation is very important to have a preparation beforehand. I think of meditation that you could say the meditative life is composed of three, you could say, primary parts. The first is an ethical foundation for the meditative life. This is, I think, best prepared by starting with humility, modesty, and deepening one's sense of devotion or reverence to other human beings and to the world in which we inhabit. And that there should be practices, I think there are practices within all traditions, that cultivate that form of humility and reverence for others and for the world. And as one deepens that sense of humility and reverence, there's a kind of moral or ethical foundation that is laid for all the rest of the work. So I always suggest to my students that they should open the door of the meditative life, their meditative work, by passing through the portal or the door of humility and finding the path of reverence. And that when they stop or conclude their meditation, they should also pass through a second door, which is the door of dedication, of giving away the fruits of this meditation, and gratitude. So you enter through the door of humility and reverence, and you exit through the door of dedication and gratitude. And then the second level or region is to create equanimity and balance in the inner life. Part of the problem with evil is the problem of, let's say, personal desire, personal power interests. It's a whole set of turbulent inner forces. And so a certain amount of time should be spent before anything else takes place of stabilizing and bringing into harmony these turmoils, these problems. If you do these two things, that you enter through humility and reverence, and that you create what I call a kind of soul or inner hygiene and health, then many of the forces which would drive towards evil are mitigated and reduced. Many of the forces that would tempt us are in balance. And if one does that, then there's a certain sense of what Thomas Merton calls the silent self begins to show itself. He makes a distinction between, Thomas Merton's the American Trappist monk who makes a distinction between the social self, the one that's commonly involved in life and business and science, but there's also a quiet self, a silent self, that is always present and much wiser in a certain way. But as long as it's noisy and filled with turmoil, it can't make an appearance. But as we stabilize our consciousness and awareness, then this gentle presence can arise, and it is from that point, really, that one meditates. And then the work, I think, is in a certain way safeguarded, that the work of meditation will be good work, yeah? That one has prepared through these two previous stages for the meditation proper, for this rhythm of attention between concentration and openness. I think it is possible to misuse any spiritual practice. When America was, this is maybe 40 years ago, when America was first becoming aware of Asian spiritual traditions and practices, the military was immediately interested, right? They want to have snipers who can be completely still and attentive for long periods of time. Well, this is perhaps a technique that we can use for this, right? Or basketball players want to win a basketball game. It is a little less dangerous, but it's not a very high purpose for meditation. But it can help, right? So there are many questions about the appropriate use of meditation. But to me, as long as these preparations are not forgotten, if you will, which they sometimes are, but if they're not forgotten, then I think meditation can only really serve the good.
Thank you.
You're welcome.